Uh, Welcome, everybody, to this webinar on Sri Lanka's economic and political crisis, challenges and prospects, organized by the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at Monash University. It's part of the series of webinars that we hold, particularly aimed at engagement with the general community, the policy community, going beyond academia. And obviously, this is one of the major issues, not only for Sri Lanka, but capturing global attention. Now, before we proceed to the formal opening of the webinar, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our 4 Australian campuses stand and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the issue that we'll be addressing today is, I think, as I mentioned, it is something which is capturing global attention. And in some ways, it is really, it has come as quite a surprise and a shock to a lot of people around the world. For myself, as someone who was born and grew up in Sri Lanka, in the immediate post-war generation, this is an enormously traumatic situation. Someone who has also studied and been following developments in Sri Lanka, if I were to recall it, in 1948, when we gained independence, Sri Lanka was seen as what several people said was the best bet in Asia. In the 1950s, Sri Lanka had higher per capita income than Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Singapore, all these places. I think it was only Japan which was ahead of Sri Lanka in the early 1950s. And then later on, partly through some of the work that Nobel laureate Professor Amartya Sen did, Sri Lanka was hailed as a country which was way up there in terms of human development indicators, literacy, life expectancy, and so on. So how come? And even until maybe about a year ago, Sri Lanka was seen as an outlier in the South Asian region, the country which was, well ahead of its immediate neighbors, even though it had been lagging behind the more dynamic economies of the Southeast Asian region and the North Asian region. It was still seen as one of the best performing economies, higher standards of living, depending on the statistics you use, middle income or even nudging close to upper middle income status. And then suddenly the whole thing has now unraveled. We are seeing pictures of people riding on the streets, long queues, waiting for hours to get food, fuel, medicine, and going begging around the world, begging from anybody for funds and assistance just to meet basic needs. So, what has precipitated this catastrophic descent into turmoil and chaos in Sri Lanka? So today we have, to address those issues, today we have 3 really eminent people in our panel. We have, I wouldn't go through in detail the description of their backgrounds and so on, because you have seen them in the description, but I just want to introduce very briefly Dr. Dushni Veerakorn, Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies, the foremost economic policy think tank in Sri Lanka, and who has been involved in both academic and policy analyses, as well as engaged in the policy debates in Sri Lanka at a very high level. She was a member of the Monetary Board of Sri Lanka until a couple of years ago, when this government came in and in their wisdom thought that they wanted more pliable people in the Monetary Board, and showing character traits that are not always obvious nowadays, so very visible in the Sri Lankan polity. She actually quit her position together with another member of the Monetary Board. So we are very pleased that Dushni is here to provide an overview of a quick overview of the economic crisis, how it evolved, where it is, and what are the prospects. And then we have Honorable Dr. Harsha De Silva. Harsha is probably, I would say, pretty much the only politician in the country whose credibility has been enhanced in the last few years. I have friends in the left, center, and right in Sri Lanka, and all of them tell me that even taxi drivers and three-wheel drivers in Sri Lanka say that Dr. De Silva is the only person who tells the truth about what is happening in the economy of the country. And Harsha is an economist by training. He was an entrepreneur, a development banker before he got into politics. And he also has been distinguished by having the backbone to stick up for some principles. He was offered the finance minister post just a few days ago. And because the conditions that he was willing to take the job were not offered, he refused. And we're very happy to have Harsha to speak on both the economics and the political, the nexus there, and provide an insider's overview for the audience. And then we have Dr. Shekhar Shah. Shekhar had a long career in the World Bank, and was intimately involved in working through in the analyses and monitoring of developments in the South Asian region more generally, including Bangladesh and the South Asian region. But he had a particular interest in Sri Lanka. He has lived in Sri Lanka for periods, but he has been involved in Sri Lankan economic policy analysis as an outside observer for quite a lengthy period of time. And he continues to be quite engaged in looking at what is happening in Sri Lanka. And he's joining us from Washington, DC, where he's at the moment, and he has had the benefit of obviously discussions with people in the bank and in the International Monetary Fund as well. And he has I guess, somewhat of an insider's view again on what is going on in these international institutions in relation to generally crises like this, but particularly to what is going on in relation to the Sri Lankan crisis. Without taking too much more time, I would like to start off with Dushni, go to Harsha, and then go to Shekhar for comments, and then we open up for a Q&A session, and we would be very happy to entertain questions and audience participation in the discussion. We want to have it like a conversation, so the actual presentations would be relatively brief, but I'm sure the speakers would be happy to elaborate and respond to questions as they come. So without taking up more time, let me ask Dr. Veerakorn to start off the proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Jayasuriya. I'm going to stop the video and start sharing the screen. I hope that's visible. So just to give some background to the economic crisis, I don't think there's anything new that I can add, but almost a recap of how we got to this point. To me, the proximate cause really of the foreign exchange crisis that turned into an economic crisis began with the decision Sri Lanka took somewhere around 2007 to borrow from international capital markets, as well as to borrow from new lenders like China. This started in around 2007 and accelerated in the post-war period from 2010, when the government decided to embark on a very ambitious infrastructure-driven recovery process. So as you can see, these are the gross inflows, foreign capital inflows to the government. The orange line is the central government debt repayments. We borrowed in excess of the debt repayments over the years, about $2.5 million in excess. Again, the assumption, and to some extent the false assumption, was that we could continue with this strategy of refinancing and rolling over debt repayments. And the central bank also used debt issuance to show up its reserves. But unfortunately, these strategies don't work as automatic stabilizers when the economy is hit by a shock. And you can see in 2020 and 2021, the government foreign debt repayments were far in excess of the gross foreign inflows that they received. On top of this, Sri Lanka has also not been doing too well in terms of its foreign exchange earnings. Exports continued to be fairly stagnant, and in some sense, the infrastructure push incentivized anti-export bias in Sri Lanka's growth process. The exports to GDP ratio declined. Tourism picked up after the end of the war, but again, from around 2019, it started to contract from the Easter Sunday attacks, and then, of course, the COVID outbreak. And remittances did reasonably well, but again, 2021 remittances are also impacted by the exchange rate volatility that was there. Now, these inherent risks in the initial conditions that the Sri Lankan economy faced were compounded by a series of policy blunders in managing the macroeconomic fallout of the pandemic. The first of these relates to the decision by the incoming government at the end of 2019 to slash taxes and reverse the IMF revenue-led consolidation process that we started in 2016. So that took off about 25% of tax revenues, and of course the COVID economic contraction also contributed to a reduction in revenue. So the revenue to GDP ratio declined, and Sri Lanka's fiscal deficit ballooned to double-digit figures from 2020, and I think even in 2022, we are expecting a deficit in excess of 13% of GDP. So notwithstanding the weakening of the fiscal situation, the government stubbornly held on to the view that we are not going to revisit these tax changes, and the new tax structure is in place for the next 5 years. So as deficits expanded, there was indefinite reliance on direct financing of government spending by the central bank. If you look at the treasury bill and bond holdings of the central bank, I think it from around March 2020 to today, it expanded by more than 900%, and various monetary policy tools were used to keep interest rates low, yield control measures, etc. So you can see interest rates were suppressed, and this huge injection of liquidity into the economy at a time when Sri Lanka had a heavy foreign debt exposure, neglected to address what the impacts of this would be on the currency. Sri Lanka does not have a convertible currency. Inevitable pressures on the exchange rate is to be expected. Again, from around April of last year, policy decision taken to artificially peg the Sri Lankan rupee to the dollar at about 200, and then consistently to hold on to that policy despite Sri Lanka's reserves declining progressively over time. And then in March, inexplicably, without any announcement of an IMF program, allowing the exchange rate to float without reserves in hand to defend the currency. So the rupee has also depreciated by about 80% since that decision was taken. All of these have combined in some form or the other to generate surging inflationary pressures in the Sri Lankan economy, the liquidity injections, the currency depreciation, and supply side disruptions. Again, an ill-conceived policy decision to ban chemical fertilizer imports and turn the Sri Lankan agriculture into organic farming at short notice, which has impacted food production, and of course, inflationary pressures also coming from global commodity price increases. So the lack of foreign exchange in hand led to acute shortages of basic essentials, queues, as Professor Jayasuriya mentioned, power cuts, 14 hours at the peak of the worst shortages, and cost of living. All of these spilled over into public and political unrest on a scale that we have not seen for decades. Now, to me, these policy missteps are a failure to grasp that the Sri Lankan economy, the structure of the economy has changed drastically over the last decade. That the fundamental macro challenges arising from our current heavy exposure to commercial foreign debt requires a different policy response. Unlike in previous crises, I think we have got into a comfortable sort of a rut of always trying to outsource our problems to the IMF. But for me, the big problem is if the political leadership and especially the technocrats, but particularly at the finance ministry, fail to assess the risks and take corrective measures, pragmatic policy corrections along the way, then I think even if we keep going to the IMF for the 17th time, we will exit these programs as soon as some positive outcomes are seen, and then keep on enduring this revolving door relationship that we have. So domestic policy capacity to understand global developments, how they link to Sri Lanka's own sort of changing debt profiles, assess those risks, and put corrective policies in place, I think that needs to be substantively improved. Until that, we will probably not be able to see long-term restructuring of the economy in any sustained fashion. So if we had some competent macroeconomic management, I think we could have prevented a severe crisis. Sri Lanka would still have faced substantial economic challenges, but perhaps not the crisis that we are facing today. It required some sensible policies and some sequencing of reforms to start on the fiscal side, and then to lean on the monetary and exchange rate side to ensure that interest rates, exchange rates are market driven. And if we had done that, we could have retained some policy autonomy to deal with crisis and the spillover impacts on cost of living measures, etc., in a more targeted fashion today. And I think in a crisis, or when there are huge uncertainties related to how COVID would work its way through, etc., it's also always sensible to have open lines of communication with the IMF, whereas the Sri Lanka's response consistently was to say, no, we are not going to talk to the IMF, and have some discussions initially on whether debt restructuring, etc., is necessary as part of the long-term adjustments to the macro environment. We didn't do any of that. So as the crisis worsened, we did see changes to the central bank and the treasury heads, and that was followed by the announcement of a default technically on our debt in April. Today, Sri Lanka can no longer afford sequential reforms. I think we have to work on several fronts simultaneously. Still, I don't see that happening. We floated the currency in March. We followed that with a sharp monetary tightening in April, 700 basis points adjustments to policy interest rates, but fiscal adjustments are yet to be announced. In that environment, it means that monetary tightening is not going to provide much of a support to stabilizing the currency. Anyone that is thinking of bringing dollars into the country will not only look at the interest rate differential, but they are more likely to look at the currency risks. And it will perhaps, given the significant risks on the rupee, we are not going to see any capital inflows to help support the exchange rate through interest rate adjustments at this point. Rather, the higher interest rates will add to government borrowing costs. It will shift resources from private investment to less productive government current consumption, and of course, squeeze growth in the process. Now, the upswing in the inflation and interest rate cycle, by no means, I think we have not, we've only seen the start of it. There is evidence that the liquidity injection is exerting some demand pull inflationary pressures, but I think currently supply is also a key driver of inflation. If excess liquidity is the main driver of inflation, you'd expect to see price increases across goods and services. They tend to be more uniform, but if you break down Sri Lanka's inflation by commodity groups at this point, you find that, you know, the big ones are here is the restaurants, food and transport, which suggests that energy and food is taking up a disproportionate share of current inflation. But when higher price expectations feed back into the process and wages start to adjust, I think that is when we are going to really face the major challenge with rising inflation in the coming months. So tighter, higher interest rates, tighter fiscal conditions. All of these means that growth is going to be weak. We are not going to see new job opportunities being generated. In the central bank expects GDP growth this year to be as low as 1%. Sri Lanka is not seeing much of a increase in national levels of unemployment, but if you look at youth unemployment, it's always been relatively high at about 20%. Now it's climbing even further. And again, that is a flashpoint for continued social unrest in the country. So the next few months, and this is the last slide, Sri Lanka's social and political pressures will remain elevated. Raising taxes, adding to already high cost of living pressures. I think raising taxes is politically fraught, even for governments at the peak of their popularity and at the early stages of electoral cycle. But here we are, mid-electoral cycle, government popularity perhaps at a very, very low level. How do you then implement these hard and painful reforms and still continue to have the support of the public to get these things through? The next steps for Sri Lanka is critical is to immediately get a staff level agreement through with the IMF. That has to be then go hand in hand with the debt restructuring talks. Again, some degree of uncertainty whether this will be a quick process or whether it will be a prolonged process. The creditor landscape is much more complex today. We have dispersed bondholders, we have China. All creditors will ask for comparable treatment. It will be in the interests of both the government and the creditors to try and sort of tidy up all the loose ends as quickly as possible, which suggests that we might end up with a shallow debt restructuring process, which means there's always the risks that in 2 to 3 years we will revisit the same problem once again. And in the interim, the government will depend heavily on multilateral and bilateral assistance to bridge the foreign exchange shortages, ensure that we have a continued supply of basic commodities and not end up with more queues and more power cuts, etc. So critical months ahead of us. I think we will face hardship and further economic pain. Whether political and social stability will be retained to ensure that these economic reforms go through. I think a lot of questions on that, and perhaps Dr. De Silva is better sort of equipped to take this on from that point onwards. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dushni. Thanks, Dushni. That's a terrific introduction. I also like the note on which you concluded your presentation. That is, here's a situation, the politics becomes central to what is going to happen in the next period, not just the economics. Because here we have a situation where the general population not only feels under pressure, severe pressure from economic hardships, it has not only lost any faith in the regime, in the whole political spectrum, with respect now, across the spectrum, there's a massive loss of confidence in the population, in the political system. And in particular, the regime in power is seen as directly responsible for this catastrophe. Under those conditions, would the people be willing to put up with further cuts, further pain, when the people who landed them, in their view, in this abyss, are going to continue to rule and ask for people to accept pain and burdens. So over to you, Harsha. This is your area. So
Thank you, Sisira, for inviting me to join this panel. It's a privilege. Hello, everyone. Yes, it's a very tough call for the government to keep increasing prices. Just now, we got a text message that they went back to Mangala Samravira's fuel price formula. So fuel just increased by about another 100 plus rupees per liter. So it's touching 450 rupees a liter of petrol. You can work out at whatever the daily exchange rate is. So this is going to be very, very unpopular. But these have to be done. Whether you like it or not, there is no longer a choice for whoever is in office. Now, let me sort of go back to what Dushni said. I generally agree with everything what she said. Just want to add a few things, my perspective. She was nice enough about her description on the technocrats' failure to perhaps understand the issue and deal with it. But I would go further and I would say just two words: incompetent and arrogant. And it's not like that these people were not warned by independent professionals, Dushni herself on multiple occasions and others, that what the plan was not sustainable. It was a wrong identification of the problem, in my view, because what the government thought was they were dealing with a liquidity crisis, and they kept telling us, look, once tourism is back, magically everything was going to be okay. We were going to get back access to private capital markets. And they said, look, let's get the tourists in, let's get the tourists in. But they didn't realize that this was like a toxic combination of two things, one being the liquidity, but other, the solvency issue. Like Dushni said, there's a heavy debt overhang, and it is both these coming together, that the balance of payments crisis that we are experiencing now is kind of unique in that both things are working together. Now, in my view, you see, when people around us, countries around us, sort of liberalized and integrated with the world, we basically remained pretty much status inward looking sort of economy, even though some tried to unshackle the economy. They were not really successful because of the political ideology. Since 1994, the same ideology, same group has been in office, and is always has been, produce things here, create government jobs, put up duties and taxes, because that sells politically, that sells. And liberalization is a difficult word to sell to the electorate. So to me, this is not surprising, because it's a prolonged postponement of essential reforms. That's the way I would put it. And politically appealing sort of policy action, essentially the welfare economics, the subsidies, giving everything free. But I also want to say, there were attempts in 2003, when the Financial Management Responsibility Act was brought in, we did really attempt to try and contain the fiscal profligacy and wanted to bring down the budget deficits and wanted to cap the debt at 60% of GDP. But I recall sitting there subsequently. I entered parliament only in 2010. These things are not even cared for. You know, what is this nonsense? Just put those things back. We'll postpone the meeting of these conditions, and every so often they would say this is postponed by another 3 years, 4 years, etc. And then we continue to spend way beyond our means. So then in 2016, when Mangala approached the IMF, there was a lot of discipline that was brought in, and taxes were, increased. VAT went up. Income taxes had to be taken up. Pay was brought in, but the politics of it went completely against that government, and said, look, what's the point in having these people increase taxes? You got to reduce taxes, give people subsidies. And the people who actually opposed the fiscal discipline came into office in 2019, and what Dushni said, a colossal mistake of misinterpreting, in my thinking, modern monetary economics, modern monetary theory rather, misinterpreting it and thinking, look, you can cut taxes and fill the hole with printed money. And I think that was ideologically the thinking of the four people who really tried to run this economy. We can talk about those details later if you wish. But while that period, 16 to 19, attempted to bring in the fiscal discipline, there was clash of ideologies again in the coalition on the integrating Sri Lanka with the world. That really didn't happen. We tried, but failed. So all those things, in my view, kept building the problem up to a point where, like I said, the trigger of the collapse, Dushni mentioned one, the tax cut, and the other, I would want to emphasize more the overnight decision to ban the import of chemical fertilizer. I think that played a equally big role in taking the issue beyond just a BOP crisis to a social, political, crisis. And I fear there is going to be a complete breakdown in the social democratic order. And what we saw on the 9th of May, I think, is just a trial run. I'm desperately worried that people will just, will no longer be able to sort of make ends meet, and the day they maybe perhaps break into supermarkets and rich people's homes. I'm seriously worried that we may get to that point unless we are able to resolve the basic needs of the people, and that's why I turn into the politics of it. And Dushni said, yes, we have to restructure the debt. We know that. But the issue really is what happens between now and the point we start receiving money from the IMF. That's a real problem for the government. I know the discussions that are going on inside, and Cicera, you said we are going begging to the different capitals of the world, asking anyone, whether they could lend us $500 million, $200 million to survive. And this is really demeaning. We are all ashamed how a country, upper middle income country fell this low. But the reality is really there is no one willing to do this. You see, I mean, if you look at the whole, how much import compression can happen. The absolute bare essentials need to be imported. And if you're looking at 6 months in the best case scenario, that we get some agreement with the IMF and money starts to come in, what happens between now and then, right? So we are not even able to get the rapid financing instrument from the IMF, the RFI. We will have got about $5 billion extended to us by India by the end of the year, because they've already committed to a whole bunch of things, and they are finding it very difficult to extend those lines further. China has basically said, look, this is, you need to be responsible. You need to fix your problem. They've extended to us $1.5 billion worth of Chinese yuan swap. There's nothing much we can do with it. And I don't see, any more, money coming in, except perhaps for some medicine and emergency aid. Perhaps $100 million AIB had said they might chip in. Japan told us directly, look, the political situation is not conducive. We have lost trust in you people because, as most people know, we basically chased Japan away, canceled their projects, and was very undiplomatic in the way we handled it and so on. So there is hardly anyone willing to extend us cash right now, right? And I know as a member of parliament that it is difficult for the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation to find $40 million to unload a oil tanker. And it is, we had invited Litro, the main LP gas company. There are queues that last for, maybe 12, 14 hours just for people to buy a 2.5 kilogram cylinder of LP gas. And that is now been, a black market has been created. And a person yesterday told me they paid 9,000 rupees for a cylinder of gas, which is supposed to be 4,800 or something like that. But they cannot find $7 million puny dollars to unload a ship of, or rather, whatever the consignment of LP gas. I run an ambulance service, and I know how difficult it is to maintain it on the one hand with fuel, and on the other hand with medicine. We had to make, I personally made an appeal to the Indian Foreign Office, and tomorrow they're sending us the medicine for a couple of months use, so that we can keep the ambulance going. So the issue is between now, as a politician, issue is between now and whenever we agree on an IMF program. And like Dushni said, China is going to be an important player here. Now, just this morning, Cabinet has announced that they picked Lazard and Clifford Chance as financial and legal advisors. So Lazards are the ones, if I'm not mistaken, who did the Zambian restructure. And they had to deal with China. And China sort of held out for almost 2 years. And only, I think, in the spring meetings this time, China said, look, okay, we will join the rest of the creditors. And from what I hear, the program is now moving rapidly. Whether China and Lazard was able to get that done on a sort of a case-by-case basis, or whether China has changed its policy, I do not know. But when you speak with the Chinese, what they say is, look, if you do this for Sri Lanka, there are lots of other countries that we may have to do it for. So therefore, we are not willing, essentially, to restructure our debt. We will try to refinance, and we will give you money to pay our loans back, but we can't take a haircut and so on. So in that sense, the issue is immediately, we know all what needs to be done. The fiscal reforms need to be done. Exchange rate has adjusted quite a bit, but that was the most ludicrous way to do that, and I call it criminally negligent. And we plan to honestly bring to book all the people who created this, and they will have to be they are answerable, they are accountable to the people of this country. People are dying here because of this situation, and if, like I said, if it gets out of hand, not 1-2 people, I fear mass scale destruction. So yes, they will have to be held accountable, one, and the reforms will have to be done too. But I keep coming back. What do we do between now and 6 months? In the best case scenario, maybe 9 months, if we are unable to get everybody to agree on the restructure, right? So the politics comes in there. I mean, like you said, Sisira, a lot of people have been saying, let's create a unity government. We must forget politics and we must all come together in this hour of need. And I completely, absolutely agree. And that is what we want to do. But the issue really is, there's a cry amongst most Sri Lankans that the people who created this crisis cannot be a part of the solution to this crisis. And if the same person who made these stubborn, incompetent, arrogant decisions is still going to call the shots, this is not going to work. It cannot work. So the cry is for the president to kindly please leave. And there is enough provision in the Constitution for the gentleman to do that. Now, I personally had a 2.5-hour discussion with him, along with 3 others, on this matter. And he said, look, Harsha, you can't expect me to leave tomorrow. I said, Mr. President, we understand that. No one is asking for you to leave tomorrow. Just give a time frame on the constitutional amendments that will remove this office of the executive presidency, and then you can go back to your home in LA or wherever he is from. So unless that is done, it is not possible to create an all-party government. I mean, people are asking me the question, Harsha, why are you not joining the cabinet? Harsha de Silva by myself means nothing. I may know a little bit about what needs to be done, but that's not what is necessary. What is necessary is for all political parties to come together. And the discussions you had with the Japanese, what they're saying is, look, it has to be a representative government of all political parties, right? So that's where the politics is, Sisira. I think I've taken the 20 minutes you allocated, but what I'm trying to sort of say here, 2 things. One, all the economics that we learned in the books, it was done wrong, it has to be done right, all that is agreed, right? But there is a period of time between now and where the IMF money is going to come. What do we do now? We're just completely out of cash. I saw in Dushni's one of the slides, she said the reserves was something like $1.5 billion. actually usable reserves, I don't think is even $1 million. We have absolutely nothing, no money that we can spend, right? That's the one. That's one. The second one is obviously the politics. How do we create a government that at least can appeal to the rest of the world as one?
We lost Harsha. Harsha, we lost you for a minute.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, but I'm back now. But what I had to say is also, I've already said what I had to say.
Thanks, Harsha. We will get back, but I will ask Shekhar now to come in. I think Harsha put the immediate challenge very clearly. So Shekhar, you are the one person in the panel who is both an insider and an outsider when it comes to Sri Lanka. So you could give us your observations on both Dushni and Harsha's presentations and any other views that you may have. Over to you, Shekhar.
Thank you, Cicero, and thank you to CDS for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I'm really privileged. Dushni and Harsha have laid out both the causes and the immediate challenges and the long-term political challenges that Sri Lanka will now face. For some of us who've taken great pride in Sri Lanka's developments over the years, it has really been painful, as I think you started out by saying, to see this slow but steady descent into the crisis. And I think the pain has been made all the more acute by the knowledge that the crisis could have been so easily avoided. Indeed, Harsha will recall that he and I were on a seminar together at the end of January. I think it was sponsored by the International Chamber of Commerce, and you and Nishant Amel had the most clear-cut analysis of how, with the fall in reserves and the drop in Fitch ratings and the other sovereign bond ratings, you could easily see a journey that other countries that eventually defaulted and had eventually had to do sovereign debt restructuring had gone. So it was all there. And I think a big question, which I'm sure haunts all of us, but particularly haunts Harsha and experts like Dushni, is how could this have happened? And how can we prevent this happening in the future? Otherwise, this pain and all the sacrifices that are being made today will not have served a purpose. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because Sri Lanka remains a beacon in many ways, has done so well on human capital achievements and a range of other areas, but now will have a lot of work to be done. So I just mentioned this, that the crisis was completely predictable and was predicted. And so I think we need to recognize this. There's no dearth of expertise in Sri Lanka. Verity's work on debt sustainability and fiscal consolidation, the work that Dushni's organization has been doing, the papers they've put out, her own writings, clearly laid out, as did, of course, the Article 4 mission in December, which said very clearly that Sri Lanka's debt was unsustainable. But even prior to that, there were enough indications of that. Harsha also mentioned, and I completely agree, that the government of the day conflated insolvency and illiquidity. They're, of course, related, but it refused to recognize that the absence of illiquidity, or a demonstration of liquidity which happened in mid-January with that payment of the 500 million bond repayment, that absence of liquidity does not mean that the insolvency is also absent or the country is solvent. So by not differentiating between them, and indeed by confusing the public about these two things, which was very apparent in many of the public proclamations that were being made, it was not possible to recognize the solutions that had to be deployed. And it was literally, we are going to go from one payment to another, and tourist earnings would rise and remittances would rise in the middle, and we'd be taken care of. So I think this is a symptom of an underlying weakness in the policy making and the policy monitoring role that the major institutions such as the finance ministry and the central bank are expected to play. And we need to think a bit about what we learned from this crisis, which is the worst Sri Lanka has faced in decades in its independent history almost. Even during the war, we did not have, in the conflict, we did not have the kind of difficulties that people are being put to across the board, across the country, and particularly those who are the most vulnerable. The government fell into a classic trap that countries faced with debt restructuring often fall into, which is procrastination. And they also fell into the second classic trap here, which is that they possess asymmetric information. The debtor knows a lot more about the debt they owe than the creditors, who are all separate and not part of the inner group that owes the debt. And very often countries assume that that asymmetric information gives them asymmetric power over their creditors, which is never the case, as country after country that has gone into default or has been near default and which has had its ratings reduced have found. So I think there's much thinking that needs to be done about how to prevent this kind of procrastination. When the writing is on the wall, the experts are telling you, the public knows this as well. I want to come to this point about the public. In so many instances, and certainly that's the image of the IMF program that is bandied about, in Sri Lanka, there's been broad public and expert support for an IMF program, including possibly on Gulf-Face Green. And in a sense, the public, suffering the way it was and is, has been ready for a fiscal consolidation and a debt restructuring, which would be aided by the funding and the coordinating and the commitment enhancing role of the IMF. And surprisingly, it's the government that has not been ready or has been avoiding that kind of conclusion. Not only the public, there's been broad opposition support. And Harsha will recall the document that all of you signed on, I think, February 11th, called A Collective Response to Our Economic Crisis, which in one page lays out exactly what needs to be done. And here's the opposition putting out a public document, whereas in most countries where there's likelihood of an IMF program, it's the government fighting the opposition, trying to get the program through. So here's a kind of unusual situation, which really has been quite, for me, certainly a surprise, that despite all this unanimous support for the kinds of reforms and the kinds of crisis avoidance that was there, we were not able to do this. So I just wanted to raise a few questions about this and throw it out, and hopefully Harsha and Tushni may be able to address some of these. I have some ideas of why this didn't happen, but I think the focus very much is on what lessons do we take away from this. And while it's going to be very difficult, as Tushni and Harsha have both pointed out, the time between now and when an IMF program is in place and the financial and legal advisors have been able to bring the kind of parity amongst creditors, and there are no holdouts, and there are sufficient clauses in the bond agreements that allow for a majority of the creditors to basically set the rules for even those who are holding out. And Harsha referred to the Zambia situation. I hope that the lessons learned on Zambia, where perhaps the country involved, China, did not reduce or did not take haircuts, but change the terms of their lending so that the NPV came out the same, and in that sense resolve the crisis that was beguiling Zambia's debt restructuring. I hope that can be done here as well. But it does suggest to me that there are 4 or 5 things that could be done, and I won't talk about the politics of it. Harsha is obviously much better suited to describe how institutional change will be politically feasible, depending on how the 21st Amendment goes and the kind of government, stable government that is, and stable and representative government that is in Sri Lanka in the months to come. The question that I wanted to refer to, or the idea that I wanted to refer to, is how can Sri Lanka build a stronger institutional setup that is data-driven, that is focused on the macroeconomy, and that can avoid the kind of turning a blind eye to the facts that happened in Sri Lanka. I think this goes a lot to the independence of the central bank, and the appointment of the central bank governor and the way that is done. And possibly a learning from this is that there needs to be an eminent body of experts who should advise the decision maker on who the central bank governor should be. Also on the monetary board, and Tushni was on the monetary board, the Treasury Secretary is a member, and that typically does not happen in countries where the central bank is given its independence and indeed acts independently of the finance ministry. So I think that's an important lesson that could be learned from this. How does the government do crisis management? We saw just total chaos in the lead up to the default finally and to the building up of the crisis. I think it was very good of the president to appoint a panel of distinguished economists on the 18th of April, I think. Former central bank governor Indrajit Kumaraswamy, Georgetown University professor, and my former bank colleague Shanta Devarajan, and former IMF staff member Sharmini Kure. But I wish these people had been appointed formally 4 months back, because then they would have given advice to the president and to the cabinet that would have been independent of whatever political considerations were driving the decision making within government. And so this could be a feature that could really be made more permanent. I believe, and I'll end here, one of the ideas that is also being discussed, and Harsha and Tushni have ideas and thoughts on this, is monitoring whatever reform program that is put in place. As Harsha mentioned, this was undone when the new government came into being, and the idea that there might be an independent commission to monitor the reform program that would keep that program honest and help in the sovereign debt restructuring. It would lead to incentivizing and a greater enhancement of commitment to the reform program. And it would also support honest and fact-driven communication with the public and the media about economic developments affecting Sri Lanka and reduce their dependence on poor quality analysis and misinformed policy formulations. So there are a number of things that I think could be thought about in the context of the longer term implications of this crisis and how to avoid such a crisis in future in Sri Lanka, while of course Sri Lanka grapples with, and the people of Sri Lanka grapple with, the uncertainty that will still be around in the months to come before such a program is in place and the financing is in place to take care of both the immediate and the medium-term needs of the country. Let me stop there. Thank you. Cicero, you're muted.
Thanks, Shega. I think we have had a a pretty good summary of how we ended up in this situation and the challenges we face. Um, and also relates to some of the questions that have been posted by members of the audience. One is, how come that we need more expertise, and Shekhar suggested that if we had, people who gave better advice, pointed earlier, perhaps this could have been avoided. But maybe, one thing that we learned over the last couple of years in Sri Lanka is that if you give the kind of advice that the president or the powers that are don't like, then those advices get kicked out. So it was not just that, it was not really that the advice wasn't there, but people who gave the advice they didn't like to hear ended up being booted out. So I think this relates to the whole political crisis we have and the credibility of the regime. Why people hold this regime responsible, and why it is going to be so difficult to get the people to accept further pain from a regime that they have lost faith in. Wonder if Shah Dushni want to come in on that.
If I may, Sisira, I mean, that's the whole point, this was avoidable. Our people need not suffer the way they are suffering today. And they didn't listen to advice. They were arrogant. So that is why there is, a collective of people, from students to, to the general public, across the country, asking for a change in the regime. Now, given the democratic structure of how this country is run, we cannot have elections for the office of the president till 2023 late. That is, if he goes in for early elections. Otherwise, to 2024, and parliamentary elections can only be 2023 March, which is about 9 months away. So that is why in the interim, people are saying, give us a time frame of, when you plan to abolish the office and leave, so that even without a change in the regime, there can be some collective governance structure put in place. So this is really the economic crisis, I doubt, can be resolved unless we resolve the political crisis. They're very much linked together. This is just not pure technical economics that we need to deal with here. It is very much more complicated because of the politics involved. So this is not what is in the textbook, but this is what is happening in reality on the ground here. So it's very much more complex than the technical answer to the question.
Dushni, do you have any?
Yes, I mean, it's not that the red flags were not raised. I mean, I recall, even if you pick up the IPS's 2013 Sri Lanka State of the Economy report, you'll find reference to bunching up of debt repayments from 2019. So, and questions raised, how are we preparing ourselves to meet these challenges? So the analysis, I think on the two things that Shekhar raised, I have a different point of view on what he said about there being unanimous support for the IMF programs. I think that's the opposite of what's happening here in Sri Lanka. It's very, very difficult to build support for the kinds of reforms that come with an IMF program. Harsha will attest to that, because tax increases, fuel price formulas that see your prices go up, spending freezes, cutting off employment to the public sector, trimming subsidies. These are, partly the reason I think the 2019 elections went against any government that says, no, we will continue with these reforms. But those political parties that come forward with a more populist approach win broader support. So I think, and that's not unique to Sri Lanka, I think it's pretty much the case across South Asia. If you look at the reform processes in the South Asian region, these have stalled because competitive populism, as we call it, has sort of taken hold. So yes, there is unanimous support for within politicians, the technocrats who understand the economics and perhaps amongst the certain think tanks, etc. But that doesn't mean there is broad acceptance, and particularly not within the Sri Lankan bureaucracy. That's my experience. And I think we need to have capacity building within our the bureaucracy and the technocracy that deal with economic management if we are to sustain any kind of a reform program. Otherwise, there is always pushback against reforms, and that kind of messaging also then reaches political leaders, and they're more than happy to not attempt reforms and just look to short electoral cycles.
Shekhar, do you want to come back on that?
Just to say that we are where we are now, and inevitably the pain is going to be much greater had the politicians involved and the bureaucracy involved taken correct steps, guided by all the analysis and all the red flags that were available all the way back several years, but certainly at a much greater pitch during 2021, these could have been avoided. That lesson should not be wasted. That is the point that I was trying to make. And the pain that the average Sri Lankan is going through today is at least an opening for political communication. And I agree with Dushni that unfortunately, not just in South Asia, but almost every country you can think of, competitive populism or that approach to political survival has taken hold, including in some of the richest countries of the world. So we are not unusual in our developing world, but there is no other way out here. And this has come home, I think, to a much greater extent in Sri Lanka than possibly in other countries. Whether it is the homogeneity of the problem that affects everybody except for the very well off, there is today a better realization of this, and I hope that this can be used both by the experts but certainly by politicians. And I know that there is an issue that there is political acceptability that's required. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to convey this message, because the perpetrators of this problem seem to still be in control. So I think the challenges in front of Sri Lanka are vast. But if we do not take this away from the current crisis, then that will create the potential for future crises of the same kind.
And I just want to add something here, the quote unquote gang of four, unfortunately, consists of very eminent economists. I mean, starting from Professor Lakshman, that started the crisis. I'm sorry, but I don't say this with any, intention of bringing discredit, but that is the reality. Then, Dr. P.B. Jasundara, these are eminent economists. Then we have Mr. Artikala, Secretary Treasury. And of course, you have Niwad Cabral, who's nothing but a politician, and who just, unfortunately, the way the institutional structure that I completely agree with Sheikh, we need to make drastic changes. Who's appointed to these positions? Overruled, the brilliant economists at the central bank. And we have the best economists at the central bank. It's not that they didn't know what was happening. Of course, they knew what was happening. They advised him. But when you appoint a politician as the head of the central bank, he's not willing to listen to technical advice, right? So I mean, so it's not like people who are running the show didn't understand economics. They were, PhDs from the best universities in the world. So there's a contradiction there as well.
Yeah, one of the questions from a member in the audience is, how do you break the deadlock? Here, are you suggesting that we go for an election now? Is that constitutionally possible? Is it the right time to do that? How can we get, I guess, relate to what Dushni mentioned at the beginning, how can we get IMF negotiations and restructuring done when we don't have a functioning government or even a finance minister? What's the, how do you cope with the immediate challenge now? How do you get the money to get the, get the oil and fuel out of the ships?
Can I add to that question a little bit? And it'd be great to hear from Dushni or Harsha and even your views. The IMF board also has to have some sense of the political feasibility of these reforms. And they are going to be tough reforms. So that question of the political credibility of what is being proposed could become a sticking point. And that might delay things even further.
Yes, I totally agree, Sheikh. I think this is now, Harsha said we can see a situation where people would be, what we saw on the 9th of May would be just a, tea party compared to what could happen if the crisis drags on, as it seems likely to. People would be rioting, people would be getting out on the streets on a massive scale. So we have I think an absolutely profound, historically unprecedented political and social crisis that has now emerged to the top of the agenda. What are the solutions? Would the IMF, as Sheikh suggested, would they take into account that this is a completely, yeah, really explosive situation, and would that change anything? Is there any way that the immediate shortages can be alleviated?
I mean, I would like to come in there, Sisira, because this is no longer an academic exercise.
No,
You
no.
know, I appreciate the views presented here, but we are looking at these as, you know, policy analysts or academics or lessons that we can learn from this, how not to avoid it in the future and so on. That's all good, Shekam, you know, Sisira, Dushni. But I am here in the middle of this.
No.
And we are looking at, I mean, when we summon the petroleum corporation or the gas company, they are telling us, where can we find, you know, $20 million? And then when we speak to the bank CEOs, they're saying, our head office in London has said, we cannot lend your country a single dollar unless it is approved by a particular person sitting in London, right? And there's so little liquidity, dollar liquidity in the entire financial system. And this is public information that the two state banks need massive recapitalization money coming in, and that's running into billions of dollars. So like the Prime Minister said, we have a rupee crisis, we have a dollar crisis, and we need to deal with this crisis today, right? And we can write the paper once the crisis is over. And then I would like to come to your university and and have a seminar about what happened. But we need to survive. I need to survive to do this. And I am serious. I have never seen anything like this. And when you have to, you know, deploy troops to protect your business place or your residence and your family and your children, you're talking about something that we have never even considered, right? So, you know, why I kept reiterating that our problem is here and now is because I see the difficulty in you know, sort of, you know, bringing in essentials for tomorrow, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that?
Well, that is the question, right? I don't know if Shekhar could, you know, communicate some of these issues, and I'm sure that there'll be other people who are equally conscious or understand that this is a, you know, a completely untenable. This situation cannot continue. But well, you
The
are in
IMF,
Parliament.
I guess the biggest question is, given all the constraints that Harsha and others are working under, and they are just incredibly tight, is the condition of sufficient progress on debt restructuring enough to persuade the IMF to go ahead with a program expeditiously? By that I mean staff level agreement by latest mid-June and a board meeting soonest thereafter, far sooner than typically has happened, and without a fully worked out debt restructuring. There may still be holdouts, but this needs to be conveyed to the IMF clearly. And they have their own constraints because there is precedent set every time, you know, their rules are relaxed. They have a rule about lending into outstanding debt issues which have not been resolved. So there's going to be need for accommodation on all sides. My question to Harsha would be, Harsha, you are one of the most capable voices to deal with the current crisis. And it's a shame, and I know that you have constraints, and Sajid and you have a principled view of what should be done. But your being in government would help tremendously. And I know that there are, serious issues around that. Just as I'm sure that Mr. Wickremesinghe has accepted a role where clearly he is not in the best position to play that role. And I know that this is all very difficult to do, and there are sacrifices that you would make for your future and the future of democracy in Sri Lanka. But we are in that situation where there are very few degrees of freedom, and there are no obvious answers.
I mean, I'm a moral dilemma here, you see, and how do I deal with my conscience? And I ask this question multiple times every day. Now, so that is why a compromise has been extended so that we can all meet in the middle. So that is where the president needs to act. And I have said this openly, and I say it again: the ball is in Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa's court. He has to listen to the people and say, look, let us work on a constitutional amendment and let us get it done. I don't care. Give us 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Just say it. Right? The president has to take responsibility for this. And individuals joining the cabinet, in my view, makes little relevance, because we need to create an all-party government so that we can appeal to the IMF and the debt restructuring guys and everyone else, saying we are all in it together. I mean, Doshni said it is difficult to do the reforms. Of course it is difficult. But you tell me, Sheikh, any country in the recent past who's gone through this type of situation, opposition members signing up, a common document. And as you know, that was the first letter in the file, or one of the first letters in the file to the IMF, saying, look, we have the support of the opposition. We've bent backwards, you see, and signed, saying we are supportive of this position, right? So you don't get that kind of bipartisan support. Yes, people like Nivad Cabral and others who said we don't need to go to the IMF, we don't need to do the reforms. Once the tourists are back, everything will be hunky-dory. Ran an entire pyramid scheme here. It is nothing but a Ponzi scheme that was run, like she pointed out, from 10 years ago when we borrowed these types of volumes. So we are willing to play, and I want to contribute. And in fact, I suggested, until such time, let us get more power into the Committee on Public Finance. That is, you see, the check and balance. When everything is controlled by the state, the government, the opposition has the power, the authority, as the chair of the Public Finance Committee, to at least monitor, to evaluate, to ask questions, seek analysis. When every bill legislation has to be approved in Parliament. Article 148 of the Constitution gives Parliament the full authority of finance. But I'll tell you, we sit there and somebody would come and say, Secretary Treasury, the Minister of Finance, look, we are going to cut taxes by so much. We are going to bring VAT from 15 to 8%. So when we ask them, where is the analysis? For God's sake, where is the analysis? Right? Doshni probably has sat in some of these sessions as an invited guest. There is no analysis. There's nothing. But what happens, because the government controls the committee, it gets through and goes through Parliament, right? So that institutional capacity is not that it is not there, but it is overridden by these political appointees who make these decisions. So once again, coming back to your question, we must find a way to break this political deadlock, and we are absolutely willing to move to the middle. And the president also has a great responsibility on behalf of all 22 million of us to make some sacrifices if he's really interested in resolving this crisis, oncoming crisis.
Actually, we are going to be running out of time. We have a lot of questions from the audience, but some of them, in a way, I think you have all touched on the lessons of this crisis. What is, is it corruption, mismanagement, or a combination, like in Indonesia? All these things, and there are also questions about, how stable the banking system is. I think. You touched on it, Harsha. So it's obviously we are on the brink of a precipice, or maybe we are already tipping over. We are over time, but I'll take 1 minute final comment from all three of you before winding down. Maybe I'll start with Shekhar and go back.
There's not much to add to Harsha's impassioned plea for taking responsibility. I think this is a crucible moment for the political players in Sri Lanka, and I do not see a way out if too much time is wasted. So this is not a matter of a month or more. I think this is a matter of a day or two, but clearly guidance has to be given to come together. Otherwise, this is going to be an insolvable problem, or it's going to become an explosive problem.
Dishni?
Yes, I mean, I also think that the politics is really the main issue facing us now. I imagine that the government may think that we need to go and fast track the staff level agreement with the IMF. That's a priority. But the IMF program itself is going to be a 3-year program. So it will mean that it cuts across not just this government, but governments in the future. And they will also want some assurance that there is buy-in from all quarters to ensure that we finish that program, because we do have a history of not finishing IMF programs. Now, from purely as a economist, from a technical, leaving the politics aside, I think the urgency is to get some of the early negotiations with the IMF signed on, and for that we need a functioning political system, a finance minister who can agree to all of these negotiations, then the debt restructuring, and then taking that entire package to the executive board. Only then will we see the IMF actually disbursing its tranches. And in the meantime, and the question, how do we manage the next 4, 5, 6 months? I think what some of the multilaterals are saying is, if a staff level agreement is signed, budgetary support will wait until the executive board approves the full IMF program. But in the interim, they can start disbursing certain emergency funds to meet the kinds of necessity, all the imported sort of essentials that we are finding difficult to get hold of. So, all of we've run out of time essentially. So the politics, the economics, the negotiations, all these things have to go in parallel, and hopefully, and unless we do that, as said, we are facing a real problem in the next few months.
Thank you. Harsha, your last comments on this. I'm sure we'll come back to all this, but yeah.
We will fight on. We will not let this country fall. We will somehow protect this nation. We will somehow do whatever is necessary to keep people fed. That is how I see my role as in the next coming few months. I think, people like yourselves, respected Sri Lankans overseas, others, must also bring in pressure on the politics. Perhaps urge for a political settlement of some sort. The top 25 Sri Lankan economists globally write a letter to the president. Say that the issues are very complex and it needs everybody to work together, and in the national interest that there should be some give and take, because this is not necessarily, of course we all understand the economics, what we need to do, and this need to be done as a package, right? I mean, what's the point in just depreciating the currency if you're not unshackling the forex markets, if you're not doing the kind of reforms that are necessary. You have forced conversion rules, you have rules that are forcing remittances back, and it's almost unimaginable. Even after the currency depreciated by almost 90%, remittances for April actually fell from the previous comparable month. Some 52% or something like that from previous April or something like that. So we are not seeing the remittances actually increase as expected by all of us. So there are these other reforms that need to be done. They all need to be done together. But all of that is true, but it's the politics that need to be resolved immediately. Thank you.
Actually, we are 10 minutes over time. So one of the people in the audience has said that I have not allowed a transparent process of discussion by getting all the questions out, but I think I've tried to convey to the panel some of the key questions as they came. I can only do that, in a very short period of time. One question, we are 10 minutes over time now. One question is, has been asked is, why did the American ambassador congratulate the president of the new prime minister 10 minutes after he was appointed? So I'll let you answer that, Harsha, and then we'll close the session.
I've served as the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs under Mangala Samaraweera. This is diplomatic courtesy. That's all there is to it.
On that note, and I apologize to members of the audience whose questions I could not accommodate. If we had another half an hour at least, we could have had a longer discussion, but the format doesn't allow us that. We have already gone 10 minutes over time. So I want to thank the three panelists for taking the time off and participating and contributing to this discussion. And I want to thank the audience for attending this event, and apologize to anyone who feels that I was not able to raise all the questions that they raised. I hope that we can revisit these in the future, because I don't think this crisis is going to end anytime soon. And I think, unfortunately, but that's likely to be the case. So we do hope that we'll have future events where we can have further discussions on this. And so I want to thank again and wish all of you well. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Once we go off.